Chapter 5. Grace, the professor's android secretary, walked silently up to where the professor sat in the large white lab, intently studying his latest experiment on the computer monitor. Shoulders hunched, his gaze intent on the image of the alien on the screen, he seemed to be oblivious to all the other work going on around him. Grace stood silently behind him, waiting for him to acknowledge her. Everyone knew not to disturb the professor until he wanted to be disturbed, and he had an uncanny ability to know who was behind him at any given moment. After a full 2 minutes, he finally said, without looking up, "Only 10 more hours, Grace. Did you know that?" "Yes, sir, I did." 10 more hours until I finally succeed. 10 more lousy hours until the course of human history is changed forever. "Yes, sir," Grace said. 10 more hours. The professor sighed and pushed his chair back from the computer monitor. Now, why should I hope to get a reaction from an android, especially when it comes to helping humanity? I must be losing touch with reality. He shook his head, half laughing at himself. "What did you need to report, Grace?" "You told me you wanted to know when the possible subject is on the move. He is on the move now." "Wonderful timing," the professor said, clapping his hands and standing quickly. "Inform Larson that I would like him to meet me in the lower storage area. We might as well give our guest a personal welcome, wouldn't you say?" "If that is what you want," Grace said. The professor looked at Grace, then sighed. "Yes, that is what I want. Get Larson." He walked away, shaking his head. Grace smiled at his back. She loved doing that to him. It took over 2,000 convicts 50 years to hack the thousands of kilometers of tunnels known as Charon Base out of the cold, hard rock. Over 2,000 men who dug their own graves as they went along. All but a very few of those convicts still remained in the tunnels and caverns, their mummified remains filling the sleeping bunks carved into the ice-cold stone walls. Andy Carrier had learned that the bodies were still there 2 months earlier over a poker game. The guy who told him had claimed to have helped in the original conversion of the base from a prison camp to a research facility, and had seen dozens of convicts' bodies. 2 days later, Andy had started searching, mostly on his days off from the kitchens, exploring the tunnels with a stolen oxygen mask. He would sneak through an old air vent into the unoccupied sections of the station, the areas not converted to the luxury needed by the professor and his workers, or the walled-off and sealed sections of the alien hive. Thousands of kilometers of tunnels and caverns carved out of solid rock, simply for the purpose of keeping convicts busy and shortening their lives in the process. And Andy wanted to explore it all. In the black, cold tunnels, Andy Carrier looked for the bodies of the dead. Andy Carrier was a grave robber, a sideline that could turn the strongest stomach, but Andy was a practical man. Working the kitchen had given him a healthy disregard for dead meat. Besides, he figured the convicts didn't need the rings and gold teeth they took to their graves. They were dead. He wasn't. And his hobby, as he liked to call it, had turned out to be fairly simple and very, very profitable. Most of the lower tunnels had been carved in a clear pattern that made searching easy. Unlike the larger caverns in the upper areas, 2 levels below the human section, were in mostly square patterns in the horizontal directions, with vertical shafts cutting up one side wall of each tunnel intersection. These intersections were usually no bigger than a large living room, with 4 black doors, one on each wall, and a large hole in the floor and ceiling near one wall. If you left an intersection and then kept turning left every time you came to a new tunnel, you would find yourself back where you started. The distance between the tunnel intersections sometimes varied from as little as 50 meters to as much as 200 meters. The tunnels never seemed to be exactly straight, but yet seemed to go in a fairly uniform direction. And the tunnels varied from normally wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side on the flat floor without ducking, to large caverns with stone tables and bunks carved into the walls. It was those larger caverns that Andy searched for. Today, the shift in the kitchen had been shorter than usual, so he had a little more energy. 20 minutes after hanging up his apron, he had the oxygen mask draped around his neck, was bundled in his heaviest coat, and was working his way down the stone ladder 1 level lower into the caverns than he had ever been before. 7 levels down in total. He had no idea how deep this place went, but he'd have time to find out, eventually. He had 3 more years on his shift before heading back to Earth. Down here, it was colder than the higher levels, and he could see his breath. The air smelled dry and stale, as if nothing had moved in it for years. Andy was used to that smell, and to the dusty, almost paper-like smell of the mummified corpses. But today, as he reached the 7th level, there was a new smell, faint yet distinct. The smell of antiseptic fought with the stale smell. It brought back memories of his mom taking him to the doctor when he was a kid back on Earth. Andy flicked the beam of his light around on the floor, looking for any sign of disturbance. Nothing. It was clear that his boot prints were the only ones in the light dust. No one had been down here in longer than he wanted to think about. He shook off the smell and the memories of his childhood doctor and shone his light first down the dark tunnel to the right, then to the left. To the right, if he went far enough, he would approach the sealed-off sections of the alien hive. Andy, when given the choice, always went in the opposite direction, away from the alien hive. Robbing dead human bodies was one thing. Meeting an alien in a cold, dark tunnel was quite another. Andy turned left and moved along, taking his time, not pushing himself too fast in order to conserve oxygen. Usually there was enough in the tunnels, but he had learned quickly the first time down here that taking an oxygen bottle along never hurt, especially on the long climb back up. And on the first trip down, he'd learned about how cold it really was down here. Now he wore his thickest coat and gloves, and the cold still got through. 2 corners and a short hike down a tunnel with an unusually low ceiling, and he finally found a wide area with sleeping bunks carved into the stone wall on the left. As the convicts had dug deeper and deeper into the rock, they carved new bunks closer to where they were working. As convicts fell ill, or died in accidents, or were shot by the guards, they were placed in the abandoned bunks and left to mummify in the extremely cold, dry air. This room had 3 bodies. 1 seemed fine, 1 had a missing arm, and a 3rd had its head severed and placed on its chest. The head had a massive amount of damage to the bones where his nose and eyes used to be, and the neck bones were crushed, not sawed or cut. The day Andy found the first bodies, he hadn't touched them, and he hadn't slept a wink that night. But intrigued by a large gold ring on one of the bodies, after a week, he had gone back, rationalizing that the convict sure didn't need that ring anymore. Now, after months of finding bodies, Andy had seen so many that this scene didn't even bother him. He first checked the hands of all three bodies, finding only one silver wedding ring. Then he dug into the pockets and found only empty wallets and worn and faded family pictures. Then he checked the teeth, finding 2 silver caps in one, and in the head that had been severed, 3 gold fillings among the shattered teeth. A fairly decent find. Whistling, he continued on down the tunnel, noticing now that the odor of antiseptic was getting stronger and stronger, even blocking out the intense cold. Chances are it was coming down a ventilation shaft from one of the professor's labs. Ahead, the tunnel turned sharply to the right, then back to the left, and Andy found himself facing an open heavy metal door, much newer than the original tunnel construction. Beyond the door, the tunnel turned, again, sharply to the left, and Andy could see a faint light. "What the hell?" he said to himself, snapping off his own light. Slowly, he moved through the door and onto the now smooth concrete floor of the tunnel. The floor in this area had been swept clean of dust, and he was leaving grey footprints. The smell of antiseptic now completely filled the air. Carefully, Andy stuck his head around the corner and looked into the bright lights of what appeared to be a lab of some sort, just beyond another open airlock-style door. He could see white-tiled floors, shelves, and some lab equipment on a far wall, but not much else. He waited a few breaths, but no one moved, and no sound came from the lab, so he crept silently forward. He'd heard a lot of strange rumors about the professor and what went on behind the closed doors of this station, but he had made it a point not to pay attention. He figured it just wasn't his business. But something open like this, down here, seemed just plain wrong, and he moved forward until he could see the contents of the shelves ahead of him. Now, in robbing graves, he had seen a lot of human bodies, but it still took him a moment to register what he was seeing. Shelf after shelf of human heads, all with wires and tubes leading from them into instrument panels, filled the room. The skin on most of the parts was a deep blue or black, and some had large patches of flaking, but yet they seemed full of fluid and somehow alive. Andy moved slowly forward until he stood between 5 shelves of human heads on the right and 3 shelves of human heads on the left. He stopped in front of one head with brown hair and looked at it closely. The hair was long and matted, and the skin tone on this one seemed to be a pasty white. What looked to be an oxygen mask covered the nose and mouth, and wires ran from about 20 different places on the side and forehead. The head was secured by a rubber ring around the neck that seemed to surge every few seconds. Obviously, a liquid of some sort was being circulated through the head and the brain. "What the hell?" he said out loud. His hand shaking, Andy slowly reached out and pulled the head up slightly by the hair. The eyes opened. Blue eyes. The blue eyes of his old poker-playing buddy, Charlie. Charlie, who had supposedly left for Earth unexpectedly 6 months earlier. Andy screamed and jumped backwards square into the waiting arms of Larson. The man's grip on his shoulders felt like steel clamps, and he fought in panicked kicks and twists to get free, to run away from those heads and those chilling blue eyes. With one quick arm twist, Larson took Andy to his knees in sharp pain. Andy quit struggling. He just kept staring at the now sad blue eyes of his old friend, as if the head could understand what was happening, could recognize him, and was somehow still thinking. "Well," the professor said, moving forward out of the shadows of the shelf of heads, most of whose eyes were now open and watching. Green eyes, blue eyes, brown eyes. They all watched. "It seems we have another volunteer for our program," the professor said. "Seems that way to me," Larson said, yanking Andy's hair back and making him look up at the professor. What are you doing here?" Kleist glanced around and then laughed. "I need to keep these alive, to keep the bodies in my labs alive. For some reason, I can't fool the facehuggers without having the real head still hooked up." He gave Andy a good looking over. He seems to be in good physical condition. Get him ready. His body just may be the one to carry our new queen. Now wouldn't that be a privilege, Andy?" Andy screamed like a wild man and struggled to free himself, to force his way to his feet, to run to the safety of the dark, cold tunnels and the dead convicts. But he was no match for the cold, brute strength of Larson. With a quick blow to the back of the neck, Larson sent Andy into blackness. Most of the heads on the shelves closed their eyes as if they had witnessed this sad sight before and didn't want to watch it again. As indeed, many of them had. The next time Andy opened his eyes, he looked down from the second shelf, the closest position to the door into the tunnels on the left. He could still feel his body alive somewhere else. He could feel his heart pumping blood, his arms floating, and something growing inside him. The blackness of space and the faint light of 1,000 stars filled the bubble ceiling of the observation lounge. The room had been designed and built by the professor, stuck 500 meters down a long stairway out on a rock outcropping so that it could be above the base. It had cost a great deal extra, but the professor and the designers from the corporation thought it worth the cost. From almost every square foot of the lounge, the view of the rocky surface of Charon base and the stars was spectacular. The emptiness of the rough surface of asteroid bathed in the faint light from the sun and the even fainter light from the sky full of stars. But the lounge was very seldom used after the first few months. It seemed that no one wanted a reminder that they were living like rats in tunnels under hundreds of meters of rock. And they didn't want to think about how far they were from Earth, and the black sky full of stars reminded them of that. Many felt that if they didn't think about it, it didn't bother them. Going to the observation lounge made them think about it, made them realize they were trapped. So, after 6 months of very little use, Kleist closed the bar that had filled one corner and just left the lounge open to the few stragglers or the occasional lovebirds. At one point, the place had been filled with plants, but those were gone, moved out or allowed to die off. Now only the empty containers remained, making the furniture and booths seem naked under the faint light. The overall feel was of a deserted living room or a forgotten old house. Cray was the only occupant of the lounge as Joyce walked in and glanced around. She had guessed she would find him here. He seemed like the type to love the openness of the stars, and she felt glad about being right. It pushed her forward with her plan. He stood against the rail in front of the main window, staring off into the blackness. "Is this a private moment of moody introspection?" Joyce said as she moved up beside him. "Or can anyone join?" "By all means," Cray said. "Be my guest. Introspect all you want." She smiled and glanced around at the empty room. "Seems we're the only ones who enjoy the view." "That it does," Cray said, without turning from the window. Sort of reminds me of the old Lover's Leaps back home. See how the rocks slope off there? He pointed to where the edge of the cliff rounded off and disappeared into the blackness below. You have a place like that where you grew up? The memories of her and Danny parked in his old Ford at the top of Thunder Mountain flashed back through her mind. It would always take them an hour to get up there, but it was worth it. They used to sit in the dark, holding hands and staring at the stars. They used to talk night after night about how they would go into space when they got out of school, live in space, bring up a family among the stars. On Thunder Mountain, on a blanket under the stars, she had lost her virginity. She turned to Cray. I sure did. How about you? He laughed. Of course. And call me John. I'm Joyce. He nodded, then turned back to face the stars. We called our little hideaway Roman Way. It was just a wide spot on the top of a small hill just outside of town. The hill looked out over the Kansas farmlands and was damn near the highest place in 20 miles. Roman Way? Like in roaming hands? Cray laughed and glanced at her. Cute, but no. Actually, a farmer named Barry Roman owned the land. Joyce grinned. Ours was called Thunder Mountain, named after a bad storm, I think. He laughed softly, and they both went back to watching the stars. After a moment, Cray stirred and turned to her. Tell me, he said, what brings you out this far from the main Earth systems? Isn't that where most pilots ply their trade? Joyce reached into her back pocket and pulled out a small folding wallet. With a gentle flip, she opened it and held it up to the faint light for Cray to see. These are my reasons. Drake and Cass. Cray studied the picture of her two kids, both dark-skinned like their mother. She watched him gaze at the picture, wishing she knew what he was thinking. Finally, he said, Good-looking kids. You got that right, she said. At least as far as I'm concerned. Of course, I'm their mother, so I would think that. Cray smiled. Justified in this case. Joyce flipped the wallet closed and went back to looking at the stars. After a moment, she decided to go on and tell him more, trust him a little more. Their father was killed during the war, and we barely made it. The kids live in Geneva now with my mother. I get 50 times the pay out here than I do in the central systems. That's why I took this long haul one last time. After I'm back, I can spend a few years with my kids. I sure do miss them. Sorry, Cray said softly. I didn't mean to pry. No problem. It's just the way things are. You learn to live with it. Joyce glanced around quickly, studying the ceiling and the walls around them. She needed his help, but she wasn't sure if she could trust him. Damn, this had been a dumb idea. Something wrong? Cray asked after a moment. You seem like a straightforward type of guy. Thanks, I guess, he said, looking intently at her. She took a deep breath. You know, there are just some things in this world I don't think I can live with. Cray nodded, waiting. Joyce flipped open her wallet again and pulled out a slip of paper from behind the picture of her children. She pulled it out just far enough for Cray to see. On it, she had written, Don't say anything. Please meet me on my ship in 1 hour." Out loud, she said, "This is a picture of my husband. Bugs killed him in the last days of the war. For some reason, I have problems living with that, and being this close to an entire hive of the things." She slid the paper back behind the picture and put the wallet away. "I can understand that," Cray said. "Some things are really hard to live with." "Yeah," she said. "I'll be damn glad when I get headed for home." They both turned to face the cold black night and the 1,000 points of light so far away. Joyce tried to keep her hands from shaking. She had just put her life into the hands of a total stranger. She didn't know why, but when it came right down to it, she felt she could trust him. Besides, she had no one else to turn to, and she needed his help. Above her, just past her left shoulder, was Earth, and her 2 children. She kept her gaze away from that area of the black sky. T-shirted Sergeant Green stormed through the main lab, his fists clenched in tight balls, his grey-eyed gaze focused intently ahead. His thick muscles rippled with power under his shirt, and men and women in white coats scrambled out of his way like they would jump from the path of a moving train. His movements just dared anyone to try to stop him, and no one did. No one was stupid enough to even try. He reached the professor's outer private office on the far side of the lab and yanked the door open, almost pulling it off the hinges in the process. Behind a large oak desk across what seemed like 10 meters of thick white carpet sat Grace, the professor's secretary. She glanced up as he wrenched the door open. She wore a tight maroon skirt and a white blouse, open 1 button too far, showing a little too much very real-looking skin. The same basic thing she wore every day. "Can I help you, Sergeant?" she said calmly, standing and moving into his path as he stormed towards her desk and started around it towards the professor's inner office. "I want to see Kleist right now!" He didn't even slow and started to brush right past her. With what seemed to be a slight push, with very little force behind it, she knocked him into the oak wall, sending an oil painting tumbling behind a couch. The sergeant bounced off the wall, twisted off the couch, and instantly went into combat posture, crouched and facing her. She stood upright, looking almost bored as she studied one of her nails. "I'm afraid he's in a meeting. He left strict instructions that he was not to be disturbed." "Out of my way, bitch, or I swear I'll—" "He was most insistent," she said, smiling at the sergeant. "Why don't I just make you an appointment and you can come back? I'm sure he has some time open tomorrow." The sergeant's face turned bright red, and he growled low in his throat. "I'll show you and that ass of a boss an appointment." He again started for the door that led into the private back office. Grace stepped lightly to the left and directly into his path, stopping him cold with one hand to his chest. The sergeant raised his left hand to shove her aside, but she merely added, "Now, Sergeant, you wouldn't strike a woman, would you?" "Yes," the sergeant said, but he had hesitated just long enough for Grace to get a firm hold on his forearm with her right hand and his t-shirt with her left. With a quick, twisting motion, she turned and flipped him over her shoulder and away from the professor's door into the middle of the huge white carpet. "That's good. Because I'm no woman," she said, laughing. He landed square on his back with a loud thud, and the sound of air forced from his chest. He twisted sideways and scrambled to his feet. Without a moment's hesitation, he charged back at her like a bull at a red cape. She hiked her skirt up slightly with one hand and caught him square across the side of the face with a high side kick. This time the sergeant tumbled head over heels along the empty top of her desk and came up rolling, his hands on the desk chair that Grace had been using. "Really, Sergeant? Why can't you just make an appointment like everyone else? It would be so much simpler." He again growled like an angry wolf. With a quick motion to his right, he faked her into a defensive stance, then hit her from the left with the chair. She staggered sideways, but didn't fall. Her fake skin wasn't even slightly cut where the chair had sliced across her face. She ducked to the left to avoid his right hook, then kicked him again, squarely in the face, her high heel digging a long, wide gash in his cheek. The sergeant tumbled back onto the carpet, and before he had time to move, Grace kicked him twice more, once in the ribs, once more in the face. He rolled hard over to get away from her, but she was inhumanly fast and was on him again with 2 more kicks to the head. "That'll teach you to stain the carpet." She kicked him again. "And that's for not making an appointment like a good little boy." Through the haze of almost blackness, he heard the professor say, "That's enough, Grace. I'm sure the sergeant has learned his lesson." Grace grabbed Green by the back of his shirt and, like picking up a young child, hauled him to his feet, turning him to face the professor. Kleist stepped closer and smiled. "I think I know what he's upset about." The sergeant spit a mouthful of blood on the white carpet at the professor's feet and then looked him directly in the eye. "You murdered one of my men, you bastard!" "As you witnessed, Sergeant, Private Choi deliberately destroyed an expensive specimen." Green couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You killed him for that!" "Try to see my side of this, Sergeant," the professor said. Choi could easily have subdued the alien with a taser, and yet chose not to. I call that a conscious act of sabotage. "What? I should take you apart one ugly limb at a time." Grace's grip on the back of the sergeant's shirt tightened, and she lifted him slightly off the floor, holding one arm in a tight and very painful grip behind his back. The professor nodded to her that it was all right, and she let him back down so his feet, at least, touched the floor. But she didn't ease the painful grip, and he did his best to focus on the professor and ignore the pain. "As director of this facility, I felt obliged to authorize the maximum penalty." "Choi was right," Green said, spitting another glob of blood onto the white carpet. "You are insane!" The professor laughed. "This is a scientific research establishment, not a military outpost. You're under my jurisdiction and will follow my orders." The sergeant tried to make an unexpected lunge at the professor, but Grace held him firm, one hand on the back of his shirt, the other on his left arm, in a lock grip. The professor only shook his head, then turned his back on the sergeant for a moment, seeming to think. When he turned back around, he was frowning. "I'm tired of your men's insubordination and locker room mentality. As of now, Mr. Larson will relieve you of all duties. Grace will arrange for you and your men's immediate return to Earth. You and your grunts are an irritation I'm no longer prepared to endure." The sergeant relaxed slightly in Grace's grip, not totally accepting what Kleist had said. He had come here expecting to die trying to kill the professor, but somehow it had turned into freedom for him and his remaining men. That made no sense. The professor nodded to Grace. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have business to attend to." As Kleist's door closed with a soft click, Grace turned and shoved the sergeant forward through the office door and into the lab. He stumbled forward, then fell, blood flowing down his face and the front of his shirt. He lay sprawled on the hard white tile of the main lab, staring up at Grace's unruffled short skirt, red hair, and slightly open white blouse. "Get your men packing. I'll have a transport ready in 2 hours." The sergeant struggled to his feet and stood, weaving slightly, as if there were a slight breeze blowing him around. His mind was having trouble accepting what had just happened. Finally, he nodded and turned to leave as everyone in the main lab silently watched. "Oh, and Sergeant?" Grace said as she moved back into the office and to her desk. He stopped and looked back at her. She picked up the desk chair and bent the metal leg back into shape with one hand before placing it on the carpet. Then she looked up and smiled. "Next time, make an appointment."